Honestly, whoever did this was probably just saying what the whole neighborhood is thinking.
Darcy said, looking at the red paint across Magnus's car.
You see, this neighborhood has a certain standard. You clearly don't meet it.
Ma'am, I came here to live in peace.
Magnus Granger replied.
You seem like a smart man.
She stepped closer.
Take the hint. Go back to wherever you came from. Nobody wants you here.
Darcy held his gaze, completely certain she was speaking to a man with no power. She had never been more wrong about anything in her life. What Darcy Wade Harper didn't know was that the man she was threatening had the federal power to destroy everything she had ever built. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The coffee was still hot. Magnus Granger stood on the wraparound porch of 14 Cedarwood Lane and held the mug with both hands, letting the warmth move up through his fingers. The street in front of him was quiet. Trees lined the sidewalk on both sides, tall and thick-leafed, the kind that had been growing for decades. The morning light came through them in long gold strips that stretched across the pavement and disappeared. It was beautiful. He wanted to feel that. He tried. 8 months ago, his wife Paula had pulled up this listing on her laptop at their kitchen table. She'd turned the screen toward him without saying anything, and he'd seen the porch first, wide and white, wrapping all the way around the front and side of the house like an embrace. She'd smiled at him over the top of the screen. "Magnus, look at that porch." She never made it to the closing. He'd signed the papers alone, in a conference room that smelled like old carpet, with a pen that kept skipping. The realtor had said something kind. He didn't remember what. He remembered thinking that Paula would have had 3 questions and a counteroffer ready, and that the silence where she should have been was the loudest thing he'd ever heard. That was 4 weeks ago. He was still learning how to be in the house. He took a sip of the coffee and finally tasted it. Last night, he'd waxed the Explorer, his black Ford SUV, parked in the driveway to his left. He did it after dinner, in the dark, working by the light from the garage. It was something to do with his hands, the kind of task that required just enough concentration to keep the quiet from pressing in. He'd been doing a lot of that lately. Tasks. Small, physical, honest work that didn't ask anything of him except effort. The Explorer looked good, clean and dark, reflecting the streetlight like still water. He finished the coffee, went back inside, and scrambled 2 eggs. He ate standing at the kitchen counter. He rinsed the plate. He looked at the clock, 8:22 a.m., and decided he'd collect the newspaper from the end of the driveway, then spend the morning on the porch the way Paula had always wanted them to spend Saturday mornings. He pushed open the front door and stepped outside. He stopped. The word was huge, red. It stretched across the entire driver's side of the Explorer in thick, dripping letters, the paint still slightly wet at the edges where it hadn't fully dried in the morning air. Leave. Magnus stood very still. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He stood on the porch steps and looked at what had been done to his car, to the car he had waxed with his own hands the night before, and he breathed slowly through his nose, the way he had taught himself to do in rooms where breathing slowly was the only thing that kept everything from falling apart. Then he set his newspaper on the porch railing. He went back inside and got his phone. He came back out and started taking pictures, close shots of the lettering, wide shots showing the whole vehicle, the angle the paint had been applied from, which told him something about where the person had been standing, faint impressions in the grass beside the driveway, shoe prints pressed into the dew that had settled overnight. He photographed those too. He moved carefully, deliberately, the way he moved in his courtroom. Nothing was touched. Everything was recorded. He had been a federal judge for 6 years. He knew what evidence looked like. He knew what carelessness cost. He dialed his sister. Rosalie picked up on the second ring, already alert. She was always alert. "What's wrong?" "Someone spray-painted my car," Magnus said. The line went quiet for a moment. Not a confused quiet, a processing quiet. He could almost hear her sitting up straighter. "Are you serious right now?" "Yes." "What did they write?" He looked at the word on his car. Big and red and certain of itself. "Leave," he said. Another pause. Longer this time. When Rosalie spoke again, her voice had dropped into the register she used when she was working, the one that meant she had already decided something. "Call the police, Magnus. Right now. Before anything else." "I already am," he said. He stayed on the porch after he hung up. The street was still quiet, still beautiful. The morning light still moved through the trees the same way it had 5 minutes ago. The coffee on the railing had gone cold. She came from across the street. Magnus saw her the moment she turned out of her driveway, a woman in fitted black yoga clothes, moving at the unhurried pace of someone who owned the sidewalk. She had a small white dog on a thin leash. The dog trotted ahead of her, nose down, tail up. The woman's head was already turned toward Magnus's driveway, toward the Explorer, toward the word painted across it in red. She crossed the street. Oh my goodness! She stopped at the edge of his driveway, one hand pressing flat against her collarbone in a gesture of shock that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was pretty in a polished, deliberate way, hair neat despite the early hour, small gold earrings catching the light. The dog sniffed at the base of the driveway and lost interest. "Is that your car? What happened?" Magnus watched her from the porch steps. "Someone vandalized it last night." She shook her head slowly, making a sound with her tongue against the back of her teeth. A soft little tisk. "That is just terrible." She looked at the word again, really looked at it, and something moved behind her eyes that she didn't quite manage to hide. Not horror, something else, something satisfied. "This neighborhood has been changing so much lately." She sighed. "I worry about what kind of element is moving in." The words landed exactly the way she intended them to. Magnus held her gaze for a moment. Her expression was perfectly arranged. Sympathy on the surface, something much colder underneath. He recognized the construction. He had seen it before, in different rooms, on different faces. The smile that meant, "I know exactly what I just said, and I know you can't do anything about it." "Good morning," Magnus said. Polite, even, final. Her smile held for one extra second, testing whether he'd say more. He didn't. She gave the leash a small tug and continued down the sidewalk, the dog trotting after her, her back straight and unhurried. Magnus watched her until she turned the corner. He didn't move for a moment after that, just stood there on his porch steps and let the silence settle back around him. Then he sat down, put his forearms on his knees, and waited for the police. The squad car arrived 20 minutes later. Officer Darren Palmer was a big man, wide through the shoulders, sandy-haired, with the kind of face that defaulted to neutral. He shook Magnus's hand at the door, introduced himself, and walked around the Explorer with his notepad out. He was professional. He asked the right questions. He wrote things down. Magnus showed him the photographs he'd taken, the shoe impressions in the dew, the paint angle, the close-up lettering, and Palmer nodded along, studying each one with what looked like genuine attention. Then he closed his notepad. "These things are tough to prove," Palmer said, not unkindly. He said it the way someone delivers a weather report. Something unfortunate, but not personal, and not his fault. Could have been kids messing around. Random vandalism is pretty common in new move situations, unfortunately. People see a moving truck and... He shrugged one shoulder. "The dew impressions suggest an adult's shoe size," Magnus said. "Probably a women's size 7 or 8. Palmer looked at him for a beat. "I'll note that in the report. I'd appreciate it." They shook hands again at the end of the driveway. Palmer said he'd follow up if anything developed. He said it with the tone of a man who did not expect anything to develop. The squad car pulled away from the curb in a clean, unhurried arc. And then the street was quiet again. Magnus stood there until it was out of sight. Then he went inside. He sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open. He didn't put music on. He didn't make more coffee. He typed residential security cameras into the search bar and started reading. System ranges, camera angles, motion detection, storage capacity. He read carefully, the way he read case files. He clicked through spec sheets. He compared models side by side. He bookmarked 3 options and continued reading. An hour passed. He closed the laptop. For a moment, his face was reflected in the dark screen. Steady, unreadable, giving nothing away. Outside, the explorer sat in the driveway with the word still on it. The woman in the yoga clothes had come back from her walk. Magnus had heard her door close across the street 15 minutes ago. He thought about the look in her eyes when she'd studied that red paint. Not horror, not sympathy, recognition. He opened the laptop back up and kept reading. The knock came just after 2 in the afternoon. Magnus was still at the kitchen table when he heard it. 3 firm, unhurried raps against the front door. Not urgent. Not timid. The knock of a man who had decided to do something and was doing it. He opened the door. His next-door neighbor stood on the porch. Magnus had met him briefly on move-in day. A handshake over a moving box. A welcome to the street. A quiet smile. William Blake was 70 years old, with close cropped gray hair, and the kind of face that had earned its lines honestly. He was a compact man, still straight-backed, with careful eyes that had clearly spent a long time watching things other people missed. He was holding a small black USB drive between 2 fingers. "Got a minute?" William said. They sat at William's kitchen table 20 minutes later. The house was neat and unhurried. Bookshelves along one wall, a large window that looked out toward the street, a coffee maker that had clearly been used many times this morning. William moved through the space with the quiet efficiency of a man who had lived alone long enough to know exactly where everything was and exactly why it was there. He set a laptop on the table and opened it without ceremony. "I put this up 2 years ago," William said, pulling up the Ring camera application with the ease of someone who had checked it many times before. "After my truck got keyed, parked right in my driveway, same as yours. Filed a report. Nothing came of it." He said that last part without bitterness, as if it were simply a fact, the way weather was a fact. Camera faces the street. Gets most of your driveway from the angle. He navigated to the archived footage, typed in the date, scrolled to 6:40 a.m. "Watch," he said, and pressed play. The footage was gray and slightly grainy the way all early morning security footage was, the street washed out, the shadows deep. But the image was clear enough. More than clear enough. At 6:47 a.m., a figure appeared at the left edge of the frame, moving fast and deliberate from the direction of the house directly across the street. Dark hoodie pulled up. No dog. Nothing in hand except a small cylinder that caught no light because it was matte black. The figure stopped at the edge of Magnus's driveway, looked left, looked right, then walked straight to the Explorer, shook the can twice, and started painting. The strokes were practiced, not frantic, not hurried. Each letter placed with the confidence of someone who had decided this was happening and was simply making it happen. The figure stepped back once to check the spacing, then finished the word, looked left again, walked back across the street, and disappeared from the frame. The whole thing took 43 seconds. Magnus said nothing. He watched it through once. Then he He looked at William, and William played it again without being asked. The second time, Magnus watched the face. The hoodie had shifted slightly at the end, when the figure turned to check the street before walking away. The camera angle caught it for just a moment. One clear, unmistakable second. Darcy Wade Harper. The same face that had stood at the edge of his driveway this morning in yoga clothes, pressing her hand to her collarbone, making that small, sympathetic sound with her tongue. Tisk. Magnus leaned back in the chair slowly. He looked at the frozen image on the screen. Darcy caught mid-turn, paint can still in hand, and he breathed through his nose, steady and even, the same way he had stood on his porch steps that morning. William reached into his shirt pocket and set the USB drive on the table between them. Slid it toward Magnus with one finger. "Already made you a copy," he said. Magnus looked at the drive. Then he picked it up the way he picked up exhibits in his courtroom. Carefully, with full awareness of what it was and what it meant. "How long has she been doing things like this?" Magnus asked. William was quiet for a moment. He looked at the frozen image on the laptop screen. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and unhurried, the voice of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. "Long enough," William said, "that I've got a whole folder." Magnus looked at him. "Show me," he said. Magnus called Officer Palmer at 3:15. He didn't lead with an explanation. He just sent the footage clip directly to the number on Palmer's card, the full 43 seconds, start to finish, and then called and waited for Palmer to pick up. He picked up on the fourth ring. "Officer Palmer, this is Magnus Granger, 14 Cedarwood Lane." Magnus paused one beat. "I've sent you something. I'd like you to watch it before we speak." A short silence on the other end. Then the sound of a phone being pulled away from an ear. 30 seconds passed. Then Palmer came back on the line, and his voice had changed. The weather report flatness was gone, replaced by something more careful. "Where did this come from?" "My neighbor's security camera. It faces the street. The timestamp is accurate." Magnus kept his voice even. "The woman in the footage lives at 17 Cedarwood Lane. Her name is Darcy Wade Harper. She spoke to me this morning, at that same driveway, approximately 90 minutes after she painted my car." Another pause. "I'll be there within the hour," Palmer said. He was there in 40 minutes. Magnus and William stood together on Magnus's porch and watched the squad car park at the curb. Palmer got out, straightened his belt, and walked to the door. He watched the footage one more time on William's laptop without speaking. When it finished, he looked up, looked at Magnus, and gave a single nod. "I'll go across the street," he said. That was all. They watched from the porch. Palmer crossed Cedarwood Lane and rang the bell at number 17. The house was large and well kept. White shutters, flower boxes under the front windows, a welcome wreath on the door that looked like it had been changed out for the season. The yard was perfect. The kind of perfect that required regular attention and wanted you to notice. The door opened. Darcy Wade Harper had changed since the morning. She was in a cream-colored blouse now, dark slacks, a single strand of pearls at her throat. She looked like she was expecting someone for lunch. She held the door with one hand and looked at Palmer with polite confusion, the expression of a woman who had never once opened her front door to bad news meant for her. Even from across the street, Magnus could see the moment her face changed. It wasn't dramatic. It was small. A tightening around the eyes, a slight stiffening of the hand on the doorframe. Palmer was talking, his posture formal, his notepad out. Darcy's head moved once in what might have been a shake. Her chin came up. Her voice carried across the quiet street, sharp and clear. "That is absolutely ridiculous." She pulled the door a little wider, as if making herself bigger. "Do you have any idea who my husband is? Greg Harper? He built half the development in this county. You need to think very carefully about what you're doing right now. Palmer did not step back. He did not adjust his posture. He said something short and even, his notepad still open. I want to see this so-called footage, Darcy said. Louder now. Because I was on a walk this morning. I walk every morning. Everyone on this street knows that. And I'm not going to stand here and be accused of— Palmer cut her off. Quietly, from what Magnus could tell. He turned his phone toward her. She watched it. The silence that followed was different from all the other silences that morning. The squad car hadn't even reached the end of the street. Magnus could still see its roof through the kitchen window. Just barely, the last glimpse before it turned. When, across at number 17, the front door opened again. Greg Harper stepped out onto his porch, with a phone pressed to his ear. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't frantic. He stood with one hand in his pocket, his weight settled, talking in the calm and focused way of a man who had managed problems before and expected to manage this one the same way. He didn't look across the street. Magnus watched him for a moment through the window. Then he let the curtain fall and went to start dinner. Rosalie arrived at 6:30. He heard her car in the driveway before he heard her knock. The quick crunch of tires, then the engine cutting off. Then her footsteps on the porch steps, fast and purposeful. The way everything Rosalie did was fast and purposeful. She knocked twice and opened the door before he answered because she had always done it that way. She was in work clothes still, blazer, dark slacks, hair pulled back tight, with her laptop bag over one shoulder and a brown paper bag from the tie place on Tryon Street in her other hand. She set both on the kitchen counter, looked at Magnus, then looked past him toward the front window. The car's still in the driveway, she said. Evidence, Magnus said. She nodded once, accepting this, and started unpacking the food. They ate at the kitchen table. Rosalie ate fast, the way she always did when her mind was elsewhere. Magnus ate slowly. Outside, the street had gone quiet with the particular stillness of a Saturday evening. Porch lights coming on, the distant sound of a lawnmower finishing up somewhere. Rosalie pushed her container aside and opened her laptop. I've been digging since you called me this morning, she said. I want you to hear this straight. She turned the screen toward him. Greg Harper, Harper Meridian Properties. You know the name? Development company. Local. Big local. He's been building in this county for 15 years. She pulled up a document. Pages of it, dense with names and figures. He's also the single largest private donor to the re-election campaign of Judge Ronald Seaver. Magnus went still. Seaver, he said. Mecklenburg County Criminal Court, which is exactly where Darcy's case gets processed. Rosalie held his gaze. Greg made his first donation to Seaver's campaign 6 years ago. He's given every cycle since. Last cycle alone, $42,000. She let that number sit. If this case moves through local channels the way it's supposed to, it lands on Seaver's docket. The kitchen was very quiet. There's more, Rosalie said. She pulled up another tab. A spreadsheet this time. Property addresses, dates, names. Harper Meridian has spent nearly a decade steering black buyers away from premium listings in this neighborhood. Not loudly, not obviously, quietly. Through realtors they have relationships with, through HOA technicalities used to slow down sales, through paperwork that gets lost or delayed. She scrolled down. 3 black families have left Cedarwood Estates in the last 4 years. All 3 cited harassment. All 3 complaints were dismissed or ignored. She paused. William's truck wasn't random. The family at number 9, the Caldwells, they lasted 14 months before they gave up and listed their house. Darcy sent them a fruit basket. Magnus looked at the spreadsheet. He looked at the names, real people, real addresses, real losses, arranged in clean columns as if the whole thing were ordinary, as if forcing families out of their homes were just a line item. The spray paint, he said, isn't the beginning, Rosalie said. It's not even close to the beginning. It's just the first time they did it to someone who had a neighbor with a camera. She closed the laptop. They sat across from each other in the quiet kitchen, the food going cold between them, the weight of what she'd laid out settling into the space like something physical. Magnus looked at the table for a long moment. He thought about Paula pulling up that listing. Magnus, look at that porch. He thought about the fruit basket. He thought about Greg Harper on his front porch, one hand in his pocket, not even bothering to look across the street. This is no longer about a car, Magnus said. Rosalie looked at him. For once, for the first time all day, she had nothing to add. She just nodded. Palmer said something. Darcy said nothing. He said something else, and then he asked her to turn around, and she did not move for one long moment. Long enough that the word no seemed to be forming somewhere behind her eyes. Then she turned around. William made a quiet sound beside Magnus. Not quite a word. The handcuffs caught the afternoon light when they clicked into place. Darcy was still talking as Palmer walked her toward the patrol car, still issuing instructions, still certain that authority was something she could summon with the right name and the right tone. 2 doors down, a neighbor had drifted to the edge of her lawn. Across the street, another had stopped in his driveway with his car keys in his hand. Darcy Wade Harper, HOA president, in handcuffs on her own front lawn, still talking. The patrol car door closed. The talking stopped. William said quietly, "First step." Magnus watched the car until it turned at the end of the street, and was gone. He didn't move until it disappeared completely. Then he went inside and called his sister. Monday came in gray and overcast. Magnus was at the stove when Rosalie came downstairs. She had stayed the weekend, sleeping in the guest room with her laptop open on the nightstand, working until past midnight both nights. He heard her feet on the stairs before he saw her, and by the time she appeared in the kitchen doorway, she already had her phone in her hand and her blazer on. "Coffee," he said, without turning around. In a minute, she pulled out a chair and sat down, setting her laptop and a legal pad on the table. She uncapped a pen. "I'm calling the DA's office when they open at 8. Magnus set a mug in front of her anyway. She drank it without looking up. At 8:03, she dialed. Magnus stood at the counter and listened to her half of the conversation. The careful, professional courtesy she used when she was gathering information she already suspected she wouldn't like. She gave her name, spelled it, stated her interest in the Wade Harper matter, asked about the current status of the charges. She listened for about 45 seconds. Her pen stopped moving. "I see," she said. "And when was that determination made?" She listened again. "By whom?" Another pause. "Thank you for your time." She set the phone face down on the table. Magnus waited. "Felony vandalism," Rosalie said, her voice stripped flat, "has been downgraded to misdemeanor mischief." She picked up her pen again and wrote the words down slowly, like she was recording evidence. Damage reassessed at under $800. Arraignment pushed to 3 weeks out. No custodial time anticipated. Magnus turned back to the stove. He moved the pan off the burner, set it aside, stood there for a moment with his back to the room. "Greg made a call," Rosalie said. "Maybe 2. That's all it took." She said it with the particular exhaustion of someone who had known this was coming and been angry about it before it happened. The footage didn't change. The paint didn't change. The only thing that changed is that Greg Harper picked up his phone. "I know," Magnus said. "Magnus, I know." He turned around. His voice was even. "Write it down, all of it. When the call was placed, what changed? Who made the determination? Write it down and add it to everything else." Rosalie looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her pen. By afternoon, It got worse. Magnus found it himself. A post on the Cedarwood Commons update page, the neighborhood's local blog that mostly ran announcements about lost cats and HOA meeting reminders. This post was different. He read it twice, slowly, before he called Rosalie into the room. She read it over his shoulder, her hand on the back of his chair. The post didn't use names. It didn't have to. It described how a longtime community pillar and beloved neighborhood leader had been targeted by a complaint from a new resident over alleged vandalism that the writer noted was still being disputed. It suggested the security footage in question had significant questions around its validity. It expressed concern about outside agitators using legal mechanisms to destabilize an otherwise peaceful community. The comment section had 41 replies. Most of them were some version of the same thing. Darcy is the best thing that ever happened to this neighborhood. This is a witch hunt. We stand with her. I want to respond, Rosalie said. Her voice was very controlled. I want to post the footage directly in that comment section and let every single one of those people see exactly what their beloved community pillar did at 6:47 in the morning. No, Magnus said. Magnus, they're rewriting what happened. They're spending influence, he said. He hadn't moved from the chair. He was still looking at the screen. Every move they make to protect her costs them something. Let them spend it. Let them show us every person they can reach, every lever they can pull, every favor they're willing to call in. He paused. That's all documentation. Rosalie was quiet for a moment. Then she exhaled through her nose. Not agreement, but the specific sound of someone choosing to trust a strategy they don't fully have the patience for. Magnus opened a new document on his laptop. He typed the title at the top, plain and simple, the way he titled case files. Record. He took a screenshot of the blog post, comments and all, and pasted it in. Then he went back to the stove, reheated the coffee that had gone cold, and kept going. 3 days passed. Magnus went to work. He drove the Explorer to the federal courthouse on Tuesday morning, the same way he always did. Parked in the same spot in the covered garage, walked the same corridor to his chambers, heard the same sound of the heavy door closing behind him. His clerk had laid out the morning's case files in the usual order. His coffee was on the corner of the desk, still steaming. Everything in his professional world was exactly as it always was. He sat down and got to work. The letter was waiting when he got home. It was sitting on the porch mat. A certified mail envelope, crisp and white, with the Cedarwood Estates Homeowners Association seal printed in the upper left corner. His name and address were typed, not handwritten. Below the return address, in small italicized text, Office of the HOA President. He picked it up. He turned it over once in his hands. Then he went inside, set it on the kitchen table, and called Rosalie before he opened it. She arrived 20 minutes later, still in her coat, and stood across the table while Magnus unsealed the envelope and unfolded the single page inside. He read it once, set it down. Rosalie picked it up. She read it twice. The second time, her jaw tightened in a way that moved up through her whole face. When she finished, she placed the letter back on the table very carefully. The kind of careful that meant the opposite, that meant she was choosing not to do something else with it entirely. The letter was formal and precise. It cited HOA bylaws, Section 12.14b. Vehicles displaying visible damage, deterioration, or vandalism shall not be parked in open view of community streets or common areas. Homeowners found in violation are subject to written notice, followed by escalating daily fines beginning at $50 per day. Magnus had 72 hours to either repair the vehicle or remove it from the driveway. The signature at the bottom was a long, looping confidence script. Darcy Wade Harper, HOA President. Cedarwood Estates. She's still signing as president, Rosalie said. Her voice was low and very tight. She's out on bond. She has a court date in 3 weeks for vandalizing your car, and she is using the office she has not been removed from to fine you, for the damage she put on your car. Magnus said nothing. She painted it, Rosalie said, louder now. She painted it? She got arrested for painting it, and now she is officially notifying you that the paint she put on your car makes your car a violation. She pushed back from the table and stood up. I'm calling a press conference. Today? This afternoon? I will have 3 cameras in front of this house within 2 hours, and I will— Rosalie. Magnus, this is insane. Rosalie. He said her name the second time, the same way he said it the first. Quiet, level, no edge. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She stopped. He waited until she looked at him. Not yet. She cannot keep doing this. She is doing this, he said. And every time she does it, she tells us something, who she can reach, what she's willing to use, how far Greg is willing to let her go before he pulls her back. He picked up the letter. This letter tells us she still has the HOA, which means Greg hasn't told her to stop, which means he isn't worried yet. He paused. I want to know everything they're willing to do before I show them a single thing we have. Rosalie stared at him from across the table. Her eyes were bright with the specific fury of someone who was absolutely right about what was happening and was being asked to wait anyway. She wanted to move. She was built to move. Sitting still while someone threw things at her brother was the hardest thing he could ask of her, and they both knew it. Magnus held her gaze. He didn't look away, didn't soften the ask, didn't apologize for it. He picked up the letter, walked to his laptop, and added it to the record document. Scanned, dated, noted. Then he sat back down. Rosalie was still standing across the table watching him. Her coat was still on. Her arms were crossed tight over her chest. Patience, Magnus said quietly, is the only thing they can't take from us. Rosalie looked at him for a long, hard moment. She didn't agree, but she sat back down. William knocked at 7 that evening. Magnus heard it from the kitchen and knew who it was before he reached the door. The same 3 knocks as before, firm and unhurried, a man who had decided to do something. When Magnus opened the door, William was standing on the porch in a clean flannel shirt, with a thick manila folder held flat against his chest. Both arms crossed over it, the way you carry something you don't want to drop. Been meaning to bring this over, William said. I think it's time. They sat at the kitchen table. Magnus, William, and Rosalie, who had not yet left. William set the folder down in the center of the table and placed both hands flat on top of it for a moment, like a man steadying himself before something he had waited a long time to do. Then he opened it. The first section was William's own records. Handwritten pages, dated going back 8 years. Incident logs written in the careful, deliberate print of someone who learned early that details matter. Magnus read through them slowly while Rosalie leaned in beside him. Every entry was specific. Dates, times, descriptions. The truck keying. 3 separate HOA violation notices sent to William within a single year for infractions that William's white neighbors committed openly without consequence. A note about the Caldwell family at number 9. Dates, incidents, a line that read, Sylvia Caldwell told me she found the fence at the back alley spray-painted. Raymond said he filed a report. Nothing happened. Rosalie turned the page without speaking. The second section was documents. A letter from a realtor, a woman named Patrice Dale, who had worked with Harper Meridian for 6 years before leaving. The letter was addressed to no one in particular, written as a personal record, and it described in plain language how she had been instructed by Harper Meridian's office manager to redirect a black couple interested in a premium listing on the north end of Cedarwood Lane toward two smaller properties on the south end instead. When she had pushed back, she had been told that certain listings needed to remain within the neighborhood's established buyer profile. She had left the company 4 months after that conversation. Then the emails, printed on plain paper, 3 pages of them, from a man named Terrence Wood, who had worked as a project coordinator for Harper Meridian Properties until 18 months ago. The emails were internal, written between Greg Harper's operations manager and 2 realtors the company kept on retainer. The language was coded in places, but in context, it wasn't coded at all. Phrases like "preserve the community standard" and "our typical buyer demographic and flag this one for Greg before proceeding." Flag it before proceeding. Magnus read that phrase twice. Rosalie made a sound, low, sharp, almost involuntary. She picked up the page and held it closer. "This is a Fair Housing Act violation," she said. Her voice was different now, not just angry, but focused in the precise way of someone who had just identified an exact target. "Multiple counts. This isn't a civil complaint, William. This is federal." William nodded once, slowly, like a man who had known this for a long time and had been waiting for someone with the right tools to arrive. Magnus reached the bottom of the folder. There were 2 more documents. The first was a photocopy, brittle-looking even in reproduction, of original Cedarwood Estates deed documentation dated 1961. He read the first paragraph and stopped. Read it again. The language was clean and direct in the particular, horrible way of that era. A racially restrictive covenant, embedded into the neighborhood's founding paperwork by its developer, Harlan Prue, legally dead since 1968, but preserved, copied, kept. Magnus set it down. The second document was a letter, dated 7 years ago, official county letterhead. Magnus read the signature at the bottom and was quiet for a long moment. Ronald Seaver, County Commissioner. The letter granted a zoning variance to Harper Meridian Properties for a Cedarwood-adjacent development, conditioned explicitly on maintaining the neighborhood's established residential character. Rosalie looked at the letter. Then she looked at Magnus. "Seaver isn't just compromised because of the donations," she said quietly. "He is part of the whole thing. If the Harpers fall, Seaver falls with them." She sat back. "That's why they're so aggressive. They can't afford for this to go correctly." William looked at both of them. Then he looked at the folder, spread open across the table. 8 years of careful, patient documentation laid out under the kitchen light. "I kept it," William said simply, "because I knew someone would eventually come who could use it." Magnus closed the folder with both hands. "We'll use it," he said. Wednesday morning arrived cold and clear. Magnus was up before 6. By the time Rosalie came downstairs, the folder was already open on the kitchen table, the documents arranged in 3 separate stacks. William's incident logs in one pile, the Harper Meridian emails and realtor letter in another, the covenant and the Seaver letter in the third. A legal pad sat beside the stacks, half filled with Magnus's handwriting. Small, even lines. No wasted space. Rosalie stopped in the doorway and looked at the table. "You didn't sleep," she said. "I slept," Magnus said. He poured her coffee without being asked. "Sit down. We have work to do." They started with what they had. Rosalie went through the documents one more time, this time building a formal timeline. Every incident, every date, every name, every connection. She worked fast, but not carelessly, the way she always worked, her pen moving in short, decisive strokes. Magnus sat across from her and did the same thing on his legal pad, approaching it differently. Not as an attorney building a case, but as a judge evaluating one, looking for gaps. testing the weight of each piece against what it would need to carry. After an hour, they both sat back. 3 tracks, Rosalie said. Magnus nodded. Walk me through them. First, the journalist. She tapped the Harper Meridian email stack. This is a housing discrimination story. A real one, with documents and named sources. I know someone at the Charlotte Observer. Donna Floyd, investigative desk. I've given her 2 tips in the last 4 years that held up. She trusts me. I'm not asking her to run anything yet. I'm asking if she'd be interested if the documentation warrants it. She paused. It warrants it. Second track, Magnus said. You. Rosalie looked at him carefully. The DOJ Civil Rights Division. You flag this through proper channels, not as someone with a personal stake, but as a federal judicial officer identifying potentially actionable fair housing violations with supporting documentation. You don't demand anything. You don't use your position as a lever. You simply make sure the information lands in front of the right people with the standing to act on it. Magnus was quiet for a moment. This was the one that required the most care. He understood better than anyone what happened to a federal judge who stepped outside the lines, even slightly, even with the best reasons. Every move he made had to be clean. Not mostly clean, completely clean. I can do that, he said. Third, Rosalie said, the realtor, Patrice Dale. She wrote that letter for herself. She wasn't writing it for us. But she wrote it, which means part of her wanted a record to exist. I'm filing a formal complaint with the North Carolina Real Estate Commission against the Harper Meridian office manager who pressured her. Not against Patrice. I want her as a witness, not a defendant. If she's willing to speak formally, her testimony turns those emails from suggestive to definitive. Magnus looked at the 3 stacks on the table. 3 tracks. 3 separate channels. Each one legitimate, each one documented, each one moving independently. Nothing that could be characterized as a personal vendetta. Nothing that relied on any single point of failure. If Greg reached into one channel, the other 2 kept moving. Start today, Magnus said. Rosalie's call to Donna Floyd lasted 11 minutes. Magnus listened from across the table while he drafted his DOJ correspondence. Careful, measured language, every word chosen the way he chose words in written opinions, with the awareness that they would be read by people looking for anything out of place. Rosalie hung up and looked at him. She's in. Donna Floyd had not hesitated. The moment Rosalie described the documentation, the emails, the realtor's account, the pattern of displacement, the covenant, the journalist had gone quiet in the way that meant she was already thinking about structure. She wanted to see the materials as soon as Rosalie could share them responsibly. She would begin her own verification immediately. Magnus submitted the DOJ correspondence through the formal judicial notification channel at 10:47 that morning. Acknowledgement of receipt came back before noon. Rosalie filed the Real Estate Commission complaint at 2 in the afternoon. By 4 o'clock, all 3 tracks were running. Rosalie sat back in her chair and exhaled, long and slow, the release of someone who had been holding tension for days. A small, cautious smile moved across her face. We're moving, she said. Magnus stood up and refilled his coffee. Don't celebrate a summit, he said quietly, that you haven't reached. Rosalie's smile stayed, but her eyes sharpened. She knew he was right. She hated that he was right. The envelope arrived on Friday afternoon. Magnus found it propped against the front door when he got home from the courthouse. Not delivered by the postal service, not dropped through the mail slot. Hand-delivered. No postage, just his name typed on the front in clean, professional font. And in the upper left corner, embossed in dark ink, Drum, Harper and Associates, attorneys at law. He picked it up. He turned it over once. Then he carried it inside, set it on the kitchen table, and called Rosalie. She read it standing up. Magnus sat across from her and watched her face move through the letter. The careful, controlled expression she maintained for the first paragraph, the slight tightening around her eyes at the second, the absolute stillness that settled over her by the third. When she finished, she set it down and stood with both hands flat on the table, looking at the page, breathing. "Tortious interference," she said. Her voice was careful. Too careful. "They're claiming that your contact with the DOJ constitutes tortious interference with the Harper's business interests." She picked it up again and read aloud, her voice taking on the sharp, clipped tone she used when she wanted the full absurdity of something to land. "The filing of complaints with federal regulatory agencies motivated by personal grievance and executed under the implicit authority of a federal judicial appointment represents a deliberate and malicious attempt to damage the professional standing and commercial operations of our clients." She looked up. "They're saying you used your judgeship as a weapon." "Keep reading," Magnus said. She did. The second claim challenged Williams' Ring camera footage, arguing that recording a neighbor without explicit consent potentially violated North Carolina's privacy statutes, and that any evidence derived from said footage may be inadmissible and independently actionable. It was a stretch. They both knew it was a stretch. It was designed to cost time and money and confidence, not to win. Then Rosalie reached the final paragraph. She stopped reading aloud. Her eyes moved across the lines in silence. When she reached the bottom, she set the letter down again, slower this time, more deliberate, and straightened up and looked at Magnus with an expression he had not seen on his sister's face before. Not fury. Something more serious than fury. "They've filed a complaint," she said, "with the Federal Judicial Conduct and Disability Act Office." She said each word separately, giving each one its full weight. "They're alleging that you engaged in conduct prejudicial to the effective administration of justice, that you used your federal position to intimidate private citizens and interfere with a pending state criminal matter." The kitchen was very quiet. Magnus looked at the letter on the table between them. A judicial conduct complaint triggered mandatory review. It didn't matter how clean his hands were or how precisely he had stayed within appropriate channels. The complaint itself was the damage. The review process would be public record. It would generate questions. It would give Greg's people a narrative to hand to anyone willing to print it. Federal Judge abuses position in personal dispute with neighbor. 6 years on the bench, the youngest appointment in the Western District's history, and a conduct complaint would shadow every day of what came after. Greg had calculated all of this. Magnus sat with that understanding for a long moment. Rosalie's phone rang at 8:15 that evening. She looked at the screen. Donna Floyd. She answered on the second ring, and Magnus watched her face from across the room as she listened. The cautious momentum that had carried them through Wednesday and Thursday moved across her expression like a light going out. "I understand," Rosalie said. "Thank you for telling me yourself." She hung up. She didn't turn around immediately. She stood facing the window with her phone in her hand, looking out at the dark street, and Magnus waited. "The story's been spiked," she said finally. Her voice was stripped of everything, the fire, the momentum, the careful professional control. Just the flat fact of it. "The editor got a call this afternoon from one of the paper's largest advertising clients." She turned around. Harper Meridian Properties. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. Greg had reached the DA's office. He had reached the neighborhood blog. He had threatened Magnus's career. And now he had reached the press. Quietly, cleanly, without leaving a fingerprint on any of it. Magnus stood up slowly and walked to the back door. He opened it and stepped out onto the porch. The night air was cold. The street was empty and still. He stood there for a long time. "Paula," he said quietly to the dark, "tell me what to do." The street gave him nothing back. He stood there anyway. He was up before dawn. Magnus didn't remember deciding to get up. He was simply awake at 4:30, lying in the dark with the ceiling above him and the quiet of the house around him. And then he was sitting on the edge of the bed, with his feet on the floor. And then he was downstairs in the kitchen, with the light on, and a legal pad in front of him, and a pen in his hand. He sat there for a long time without writing anything. He thought about Paula. Not the end. He worked hard not to think about the end, but earlier. Law school. The way she used to sit across from him at the library table with a highlighter in her mouth, and 3 books open at once, absolutely certain that every problem had a solution if you were willing to read far enough. She had believed that completely. She had believed it about the law, the way some people believe in something larger than themselves. Read far enough, Magnus. He picked up the pen. The first call was to Councilwoman Pamela Ortiz. She picked up on the 3rd ring, her voice alert despite the early hour. A woman who had been doing this long enough that early calls didn't startle her anymore. "Pamela," Magnus said. "It's Magnus Granger. I'm sorry for the time. Don't apologize. What do you need?" He told her. Not everything, not yet, but enough. The documented fair housing violations, the pattern of displacement, William's folder. He asked if she would be willing to formally receive a citizen presentation before the Housing and Community Development Committee. On the record. He told her he had documentation that warranted it. There was a short pause. "How solid is it?" she said. "Solid enough that I'm calling you at 5 in the morning." Another pause. Then, "Yes. Call my office when it opens and set the date." She hung up without ceremony. Magnus wrote her name on the legal pad and put a line through it. The second call was to Judge Harold Freeman, Eastern District, a colleague Magnus had known for 4 years, a careful and precise man whose judgment he trusted completely. He asked for a recommendation. The best fair housing litigator currently in practice. Someone with federal case experience and no existing ties to North Carolina's local political infrastructure. Freeman didn't hesitate. Alice Miller, Washington, D.C. She's argued 3 landmark FHA cases in the last decade and won all 3. Civil Rights Division background before private practice. She doesn't take cases she doesn't intend to win. He paused. "You want the number?" "Please." He called Alice Miller immediately after. It rang 4 times, and he was preparing to leave a message when she picked up. A voice that was direct and unhurried, with the particular quality of someone who decided quickly and didn't revisit the decision. Magnus gave her the situation in 6 minutes. He was concise. He had spent 20 years learning to say exactly what needed to be said, and nothing else. When he finished, Alice Miller was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Granger," she said, "I've been waiting for a case like this." "It's Judge Granger," he said. Not to correct her, to tell her something. A beat of silence. Then her voice shifted. The same directness, but with a new quality underneath it. Interest, sharpening into focus. "Send me everything tonight. I'll have my associate review the FHA documentation in the morning, and I'll call you by noon." Magnus wrote her name on the legal pad. Drew a line through it. The third call was to William. William picked up immediately, as if he had been awake too. 3 copies of everything in that folder, Magnus said. "Every document, every page. 1 goes to my sister, 1 goes to an attorney named Alice Miller. I'll give you the address. 1 you keep yourself, somewhere other than your house." "Already done," William said. Magnus stopped writing. "I made copies the night I brought it over," William said simply. "I've been keeping things in 2 places for years." Magnus looked at the legal pad. All 3 names crossed out. 3 calls, each one landing exactly where it needed to. He turned to a new page. He wrote a single heading at the top. Voluntary recusal statement. Below it, he began drafting precise, formal, measured language that acknowledged the pending conduct review and removed himself from his current docket not out of guilt, but out of the absolute, unimpeachable cleanliness that had carried him this far. Greg had filed the complaint to threaten him into silence. Instead, it had handed Magnus the opportunity to put everything on the record, formally, officially, permanently, with a counterfiling copied to the Judicial Council of the Fourth Circuit, laying out every act of retaliation in documented sequence. The complaint was supposed to be a weapon. Magnus had just turned it around. Alice Miller arrived on a Tuesday. She came off the Charlotte Douglas concourse pulling a single carry-on, a leather portfolio under one arm, moving through the terminal at a pace that suggested she already knew where she was going. She was 61, trim and deliberate, with close-cropped natural hair, and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She looked like what she was, a woman who had walked into difficult rooms for 3 decades and had never once walked out without what she came for. Magnus met her at the curb. They shook hands. "I read everything you sent," she said, before he'd spoken. "Twice. Once as an attorney, and once as someone who grew up in a neighborhood exactly like Cedarwood Estates." She looked at him steadily. "Let's get to work." They spread William's folder across Magnus's dining room table. Rosalie was already there when they arrived. The documents separated into the same 3 stacks she and Magnus had built on Wednesday morning, with her own legal notes clipped to each section. She and Alice acknowledged each other with the quick, mutual recognition of 2 people who understood immediately they were working toward the same thing and did not need to establish that fact through small talk. Alice went through the folder the same way Magnus had, slowly, reading everything fully, asking precise questions when she needed clarification and none when she didn't. She moved through William's incident logs, the HOA violation records, the realtor's letter, the Harper Meridian emails. When she reached the covenant and the Seaver letter, she stopped. She read both documents twice. Then she set them down and took her reading glasses off her forehead and held them in one hand, looking at the table. "The covenant is legally inert," she said. "You both know that. We can't prosecute a 1961 document." She paused. "But Greg Harper found this 11 years ago and made a deliberate choice not to flag it for removal. That choice, placed alongside these emails and this pattern of conduct, speaks to intent. Not historical intent, current intent." She looked at Rosalie. "That's what FHA enforcement turns on. Not a single act, a pattern with intent behind it. This folder is a pattern." Rosalie nodded. "That's what I told Magnus." "She's right," Alice said to Magnus. "She usually is," Magnus said. Alice made 2 calls that afternoon from the guest chair in Magnus's study. The door closed, her voice inaudible through it. When she came out, she had her portfolio open and a pen in her hand. "Terrence Wood," she said, "former Harper Meridian project coordinator. The man who printed those emails." "He left the company 18 months ago," Rosalie said. "He did." Alice sat down. "And he has been waiting, apparently, for someone to call him with enough weight behind them to make a formal statement worth the risk." She wrote something on the pad. "He'll speak. He wants to do it formally and on record. He said, and I'm quoting directly, 'I've had this sitting on my conscience long enough.'" She made the second call notation beside his name. "Patrice Dale," she said. "The realtor." "She wrote the letter," Rosalie said. "But she wasn't writing it for us." "No," Alice said. "She was writing it for herself, which means she already made the moral decision. She just needed someone to show her there was a safe structure to step into." She looked up. "She'll cooperate. I've seen this before. People who document things privately are people who are always going to speak. They were just waiting for the right moment." The DOJ Civil Rights Division formally opened the Fair Housing Act investigation into Harper Meridian Properties on Thursday morning. Subpoenas were issued to Harper Meridian's corporate financial records, internal communications, and transaction histories going back 9 years. Magnus received notification through proper channels. He read it at his desk in chambers and sat quietly for a moment before returning to the case file in front of him. That same afternoon, the Fourth Circuit Judicial Council, reviewing Magnus's counterfiling, noted the documented relationship between Greg Harper and Ronald Seaver. The council initiated a quiet, formal inquiry into whether Seaver should have recused himself from any matters touching Harper's interests. A regional investigative outlet, operating entirely outside the reach of Harper Meridian's advertising budget, received a tip about the Seaver inquiry and began making calls to the county commissioner's office. Greg Harper was in his office when his assistant brought him the subpoena. He read it once, set it flat on his desk, picked up his phone and scrolled to the first name he always called when things needed managing. It rang 6 times. No answer. He scrolled to the next name. That one didn't answer either. Greg sat very still at his desk, the subpoena in front of him, the phone quiet in his hand. And for the first time since this began, the look on his face was not calculation. It was something else. Something new. The notice went out on a Monday. A special session of the Cedarwood Estates Homeowners Association Board, called by 2 sitting board members citing urgent matters of governance requiring immediate attention. Wednesday evening, 7 o'clock. The community room at the end of Cedarwood Lane, the same beige-carpeted room where Darcy had presided over every meeting for the past 4 years, where she had introduced bylaw amendments and beautification proposals and violation schedules with the comfortable authority of someone who had never once been challenged. Magnus slipped the notice under William's door the same afternoon he received his own copy. William read it on his porch and looked across at Magnus. "Wednesday," William said. "Wednesday," Magnus said. They arrived early. Magnus, Rosalie, William, and 2 other black homeowners from the south end of the street, James and Carol Whitfield, who had received 11 HOA violation notices in 3 years and never once been told why the enforcement on their block ran so differently from the north end. Alice Miller came directly from her hotel, leather portfolio under her arm, reading glasses on her forehead. Councilwoman Pamela Ortiz arrived last 3 minutes before 7, in a charcoal blazer with her HOA notice in her hand, not because she needed it, but because she wanted Darcy to see that she had one. They arranged themselves on the left side of the long folding table. The 5 white HOA board members filtered in across from them, taking their usual seats with the uneasy energy of people who had been told a meeting was important, but had not been told exactly how. They glanced at Alice Miller. They glanced at Councilwoman Ortiz. They looked at each other. Darcy came in last. She walked to the head of the table the way she always walked to the head of the table. Direct, unhurried, one hand already reaching for the back of the chair she had occupied for 4 years. She was in a dark blazer, the pearls at her throat, her expression set in the particular composed arrangement she wore to every meeting. In control, prepared, home. She pulled out the chair and sat down. She looked across the table. For just a moment, one brief, unguarded moment, something moved across her face when she saw Councilwoman Ortiz. Not fear, exactly. The recognition of a shift in the room's weight that she hadn't anticipated and could not immediately calculate. Then the composure came back. "Let's call the meeting to order," she said. Rosalie stood up. She didn't ask for the floor. She simply stood, opened her folder, and began speaking in the clear, steady voice she used in courtrooms. Not loud, not aggressive, but the kind of voice that made the room get quiet, because it understood something serious was being said. She laid it out, piece by piece. The HOA violation records, the disproportionate enforcement targeting black homeowners on the south end of the street, dating back 6 years. The Caldwell family timeline. Every incident, every date, every dismissal. Williams' incident log, read aloud in Williams' own words, each entry specific and dated and undeniable. The realtor's account, the Harper Meridian emails. And finally, the 1961 covenant, not as a legal instrument, but as evidence of an ideology that had been deliberately preserved, deliberately concealed, and deliberately enacted through every HOA decision Darcy had made for 4 years. The room was completely still. One of the board members, a man named Patterson, who had served on the board for 6 years and voted with Darcy on every motion she had ever brought, was looking at the table in front of him. Not at Rosalie. Not at Darcy. At the table, with the expression of someone doing a very uncomfortable private calculation. Rosalie set down her folder. "I move," she said, "for the immediate removal of Darcy Wade Harper as HOA president, pending the outcome of the federal fair housing investigation currently being conducted by the Department of Justice into the conduct of Harper Meridian Properties and its associated agents." The silence held for 3 full seconds. Darcy's chin came up, her mouth opened. "This is completely—" "I'll second that motion," Patterson said. Darcy stopped. She turned and looked at him. He did not look back at her. His eyes stayed on the table. The vote was called. 3 board members voted to remove. 2 abstained. No one voted against. Rosalie sat down. The room was quiet. Alice Miller made a note in her portfolio. Councilwoman Ortiz folded her hands on the table and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. At the head of the table, Darcy Wade Harper sat very still. Then, slowly, she reached forward and placed both hands around the HOA president's gavel. She looked at it for a moment. She set it on the table. The sound it made was small and final and absolute. The weeks that followed moved differently. Not faster. If anything, the legal machinery moved with the slow, grinding deliberateness that Magnus had spent his entire career watching. But it moved with direction now, with weight behind it. Every morning he came downstairs to find Rosalie already at the kitchen table with her laptop open, tracking each development the way a navigator tracks position. Constantly, precisely, adjusting as new information arrived. She kept a separate document now. Not the record. Something else. She called it consequences. The DA reversed course first. The felony vandalism charge against Darcy Wade Harper was reinstated on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after the HOA meeting. Magnus learned about it from Rosalie, who had learned about it from a source inside the DA's office, who had watched the original downgrade with private discomfort and was relieved to see it corrected. The DOJ investigation had changed the atmosphere. Suddenly, the careful reduction of Darcy's charges looked less like routine prosecutorial discretion and more like something that would eventually need to be explained to federal investigators. Greg's attorney, a sharp man named Douglas Drum, who had spent 20 years being the smartest person in local courtrooms, looked at the scope of the DOJ investigation and did what smart attorneys do when the ground shifts. He called Rosalie on a Wednesday afternoon. His client, Rosalie told Magnus afterward, her voice carefully neutral, would like to discuss a resolution. Greg's client was not Greg. It was Darcy. The plea was entered on a Thursday. Felony vandalism. Guilty. 180 days. Suspended. 2 years probation. $15,000 in restitution. Covering the explorer's damage, Magnus's legal costs, and court fees. 200 hours of mandatory community service, specifically designated fair housing education and outreach work. The judge read the terms into the record without expression. Darcy sat at the defendant's table in the same dark blazer she had worn to the HOA meeting. The pearls were at her throat. She looked straight ahead when the terms were read. She said guilty when she was asked to say it, quietly, with the precise intonation of someone who had rehearsed how to make the word sound like as little as possible. It still sounded like everything. Magnus was not in the courtroom. He had no business being there, and he knew it. He was in his chambers when Rosalie texted him a single word. Done. He sat with that for a moment. Then he went back to work. The DOJ consent decree came 4 weeks later. Harper Meridian Properties, Fair Housing Act violations, multiple counts, discriminatory steering, coordinated harassment, retaliatory HOA enforcement. The investigation had moved faster than federal investigations typically moved, propelled by the quality of the documentation, the cooperation of Terrence Wood and Patrice Dale, and the formal statements of 3 families who had been driven out of Cedarwood Estates and had never stopped knowing exactly why. The total, $2.3 million. Penalties, restitution, remediation. William Blake received a settlement. The Whitfield family received one, and Raymond and Sylvia Caldwell, who had packed their house and left Cedarwood Lane 3 years ago because the harassment had ground them down past the point of endurance, received the largest individual settlement of all. Greg Harper was barred from serving on any HOA board or real estate commission in the state for 10 years. His major development project, a 400-unit complex that had required city council approval, was quietly removed from the agenda. The council members who had been enthusiastically supportive of it 6 weeks earlier had nothing to say about it now. Raymond Caldwell drove up from Raleigh on the day he gave his formal DOJ statement. He wore a suit. He sat across from the investigator for 2 hours and said everything he had spent 3 years carrying. Calmly, completely, with the exhausted relief of a man finally setting something heavy down. When he came out of the federal building, Magnus was in the corridor. They had never met. Raymond stopped. He looked at Magnus for a moment. The same age, the same kind of face. The face of a man who understood exactly what the other had been through without needing it explained. Magnus extended his hand. Raymond took it. "Thank you," Raymond said quietly, "for not leaving." Magnus held his hand a moment longer than a handshake required. Judge Ronald Seaver's public censure was issued by the Fourth Circuit on a Friday morning, the first censure that Circuit had issued in 11 years. He announced his retirement from the bench 6 weeks later, in a brief statement that cited personal reasons and thanked the public for their support. The judicial conduct complaint against Magnus Granger was dismissed the same week. The Judicial Council's written statement was unambiguous. The complaint had been filed in bad faith as an instrument of retaliation and had no merit. The statement was public record, permanent and clear. Rosalie read it at the kitchen table and looked up at Magnus. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She just opened her laptop and added it to consequences. 3 months later, it was a Saturday again. The same kind of morning. Soft light through the trees, the street quiet, the air carrying just enough of a chill to make a hot drink feel like something worth having. Magnus stood at the kitchen counter and waited for the coffee to finish. He listened to the house around him. The particular silence of it, not the heavy, pressing silence of those first weeks. The kind that leaned against you and reminded you of everything missing. Something different now, quieter in a better way, like a room that had finally settled into itself. He poured the coffee. He carried it to the front door and stepped outside. The wraparound porch was exactly what Paula had wanted. He had put a chair out here 2 weeks ago, a wide wooden chair with a cushion she would have said was the wrong shade of green, and then kept anyway because it was comfortable. He sat in it now, and put both hands around the mug and felt the warmth move up through his fingers the same way it had on that first morning, 3 months ago, when he had stood in this same spot, and the street had been beautiful, and he had been trying to feel that. He felt it now. He took a sip of the coffee. He tasted it. Across the street, 17 Cedarwood Lane had a for sale sign in the front yard. It had gone up 9 days ago. A clean white sign with a real estate company's logo on it, planted squarely in the center of the lawn that Darcy had kept so perfectly edged for so many years. Magnus had seen Greg loading boxes into a moving truck 2 weekends prior. Early in the morning, efficient and silent, not looking across the street. No fruit basket, no handwritten note, just boxes and a truck, and then an empty driveway. The house they had spent years trying to protect from people like Magnus was now a house they were leaving. Magnus looked at the for sale sign for a moment. Then he looked away from it. Not because it bothered him, but because it didn't require any more of his attention. It was simply a fact, a result. One of many that Rosalie had added to the consequences document over the past weeks, until the document was long and specific and complete. He looked at the trees instead, at the morning light coming through them in long gold strips. He heard William's door. His neighbor crossed the lawn between their houses at his usual unhurried pace, moving through the morning with the ease of a man who had earned the right to move slowly. He was carrying something in both hands, a small clay pot, soil dark, with a gardenia plant nestled inside it. White blooms just beginning to open, the smell of them reaching Magnus before William made it to the porch steps. William came up the steps and held the pot out. Paula liked gardenias, he said. Magnus looked at the plant, the white blooms, the smell of them, clean and soft in the morning air. You mentioned it once, William said. Few weeks back. I don't think you remember saying it. Magnus didn't remember saying it. He took the pot carefully in both hands. He looked at it for a long moment, the blooms just starting to open, the leaves dark and glossy, the soil still damp, something that was alive and intended to keep being alive. How did you know? Magnus said. I didn't, William said simply. It seemed right. Magnus set the pot on the porch railing, exactly where Paula would have put it, in the spot that caught the morning light. He looked at it there. It looked correct in the way some things are correct without explanation. William sat down in the other chair, the one Magnus had put out meaning to have company eventually. They sat together without filling the silence, the way two people sit when they have already said everything that needed saying, and what remains is simply the comfortable fact of each other's presence. His phone buzzed on the armrest. Rosalie. He smiled before he answered. He could already hear her from the first word, electric and purposeful, the momentum she always carried. We've got one, she said. Different city, same pattern. Alice thinks it's stronger than Cedarwood. She paused just long enough to breathe. You in? Magnus watched the gardenia on the railing, the blooms catching light. Call me tonight, he said. Tell me everything. He hung up, set the phone down, picked up his coffee. William glanced over at him. Good news? Yes, Magnus said. He looked at the street, quiet and tree-lined, and full of ordinary morning light. The for sale sign across the way asking nothing of him. The gardenia beside him, white and open and exactly right. He thought of Paula, not the end, the beginning, the library table, the highlighter, the 3 open books, and her voice across the years, steady and certain. Read far enough, Magnus. He took a long, slow sip of the coffee. It was still hot. This time, he tasted every bit of it. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.